Right now, on this exact day, more human beings will watch a small group of people kick a ball across a field than will vote in most national elections. More than will attend religious services in most countries combined. More than will watch every other sporting event on Earth put together. And the strange part is this: the game itself requires almost nothing. No equipment budget, no specialized terrain. Just a ball, a flat patch of ground, and two goals made from anything you can find. So, how did the simplest game on Earth become its most powerful shared ritual? And why did it spread faster and further than any religion, language, or ideology in human history? The answer is not really about football. It is about what happens when something simple meets something structural. And once you see the structure, you will never watch a match the same way again. Start with the myth you probably already believe, that football began in England in the 19th century. That is only half true, and the half that is missing tells you something important. Ball games involving feet go back thousands of years. The Chinese game of Cuju, played as early as the Han Dynasty over 2,000 years ago, involved kicking a leather ball through a small opening in a net. Mesoamerican civilizations played ball games with rubber balls and stone courts for reasons that were part sport, part religious ritual. Ancient Greeks and Romans played their own kicking games. Humans, it seems, have always wanted to kick something and score. That impulse is old. What England did was not invent the game. England did something more consequential. It wrote down the rules. In 1863, a group of clubs in London met to settle a dispute that had been dividing football for years. Some players wanted to carry the ball with their hands. Others wanted a game played only with the feet. The clubs that wanted a strictly foot-based game formed the Football Association. The clubs that wanted to carry the ball walked away and eventually built what became rugby. That single meeting in a single room created a boundary that the entire modern sport still lives inside. The historian David Goldblatt, in his sweeping history of the sport titled "The Ball is Round," argues that this codification moment mattered less because of the specific rules and more because it made the game exportable. A game with fixed rules can be taught anywhere, played anywhere, and refereed by anyone who knows the rulebook. You cannot export a folk tradition passed down through unwritten local custom. You can export a document. And export it, England did, almost entirely by accident. The British Empire, at its height, controlled roughly a quarter of the Earth's land surface. Wherever British sailors, merchants, soldiers, and engineers went, they brought the game with them the way they brought their language and their tea. Dock workers played it in port cities. Railway engineers played it while building lines across South America. School teachers played it while establishing colonial academies in Africa and Asia. Nobody planned this as a strategy of cultural influence. It happened because bored young men with a ball will play regardless of where they are stationed. But the consequence was a global diffusion network, more efficient than any deliberate marketing campaign could have designed. By 1900, football was being played on every inhabited continent, not because anyone chose it, but because the people carrying it did not realize they were carrying anything at all. Here is where the story becomes genuinely strange. The colonizers left. The game stayed. And in almost every former colony, the local population did not merely adopt football, they turned it into a weapon against the very empire that introduced it. The historian Eric Hobsbawm, writing about the relationship between sport and nationalism, observed that international football became one of the few arenas where colonized or newly independent nations could defeat their former rulers in a contest the world was actually watching. When Argentina beat England, when Brazil rose to global dominance, when African nations began stunning European teams in World Cup tournaments, something deeper than sport was happening. A small country could not challenge a former empire militarily or economically, but it could beat them 2-1 on a football pitch, in front of a global audience, and that victory carried a symbolic weight entirely disproportionate to the actual stakes of the game. Football became one of the only spaces where the power dynamics of the modern world could be temporarily, publicly, gloriously reversed. This is the first reason football conquered the world. It gave the powerless a stage where they could occasionally briefly become powerful. But there is a second reason, and it has nothing to do with empire. It has to do with economics of accessibility that almost no other major sport can match. Basketball requires a hoop set at a precise regulation height. Baseball requires gloves, bats, and a specific field geometry. American football requires padding that most of the world cannot afford, and rules so complex that casual play is nearly impossible. Football requires a ball. That is functionally the entire barrier to entry. Children in Lagos, in Buenos Aires, in Manila, and in rural France can all begin playing with a ball made of rags tied together, using rocks as goalposts on any surface flat enough to run on. The economist Stefan Szymanski, who studies the economics of global sport, has pointed out that this near-zero cost of entry created something unusual in the history of games. A sport where the talent pool is effectively the entire population of the planet, not just the portion who can afford specialized equipment. When the barrier to participation approaches zero, the size of the potential talent base approaches everyone. This is why football's greatest players so often emerge from conditions of poverty rather than privilege. It is not despite the lack of resources. It is partly because of it. When any child with a ball and bare feet has a plausible path toward a global stage, an enormous number of the most talented, hungriest, most creative players will come from places that had almost nothing else to offer them. The third reason runs even deeper than economics, and it explains why football became not just a sport people play, but a ritual people organize their identity around. The French anthropologist Christian Bromberger, who spent years studying football fandom in Italy and France, described match day as functioning like a modern rite of collective effervescence, a term borrowed from the sociologist Emile Durkheim to describe the intense, almost sacred energy that emerges when a large group of people synchronize their emotions around a shared symbol. A stadium full of strangers who will never speak to each other outside that space will scream in unison, grieve in unison, and celebrate in unison, bound together by nothing more than a shared color and a shared outcome. Bromberger argued that in societies where traditional religious ritual had weakened, football stadiums had quietly absorbed some of that same emotional function. You do not need to believe in anything supernatural to feel the crowd around you become, for 90 minutes, a single organism. Think about what that actually requires from a psychological standpoint. Humans are wired for tribal belonging. For most of human history, that belonging was organized around family, clan, and immediate geography. The people you would literally have hunted with, farmed with, and defended territory alongside. Modern life dissolved most of those tight-knit structures. Football rebuilt a version of them at scale. A supporter of a club does not simply enjoy watching a game. They inherit an identity, often literally passed from parent to child, worn as a colored shirt, defended verbally in workplaces and pubs, carried through decades of disappointment and occasional triumph. The club becomes a proxy tribe in a world that stopped providing tribes. And unlike most modern identities which are chosen and can be abandoned, football loyalty is famously, almost pathologically sticky. People do not switch teams the way they switch phone providers. The identity, once formed, tends to last a lifetime. Then came television, and everything scaled again. Once matches could be broadcast, the emotional experience of the stadium could be exported into millions of living rooms simultaneously. The World Cup became not just a tournament, but a genuinely synchronized global event. One of the very few moments in human history where more than half the planet's population is, at some point across a single month, watching the same unfolding narrative. No war, election, or natural disaster commands that kind of unified simultaneous attention. A football tournament does, every 4 years by design. And here's the final twist, the one that closes the loop back to where this all began. The game that conquered the world did so without a single central authority ever planning it. No government funded football's global expansion as policy. No corporation invented it as a product line. It spread the way a language spreads, the way a joke spreads, carried person to person because it was simple enough to need no instructions and flexible enough to absorb whatever cultural meaning a given place needed it to carry. In Brazil, it became an expression of joyful improvisation. In Germany, it became an expression of disciplined engineering. In Argentina, it became inseparable from working-class pride and political defiance. Same 22 players, same size ball, same basic rules written in a London room in 1863. And yet somehow, everywhere it landed, it became something slightly different, shaped by the culture that received it, while never stopping being recognizably itself. So the next time you watch a crowd of 80,000 strangers rise to their feet in a single unified roar, understand what you are actually witnessing. You are not just watching a sport. You are watching one of the last remaining structures on Earth simple enough to belong to everyone and flexible enough to mean something different to each of them. A document written in a room in 1863 became a language spoken by every nation on Earth. And on this exact day, more people are speaking it through 80,000 voices, through a small leather ball rolling across grass, than are speaking almost any other language humanity has ever built.